Dying alone on the blood-soaked battlefield, Lyra's shrill screams pierced the smoke-filled air as her Andorian comrades fled, leaving her wounded, abandoned, and betrayed. They viewed her as weak, a disgraceful failure for not completing their ruthless mission. Their harsh, unforgiving culture dictated that she meet an agonizing death for such a fatal error. But amid the carnage, a human patrol led by medic and soldier Dylan Ward heard her desperate cries and pursued the distress signal. They discovered Lyra clinging to life, grievously injured, bleeding out on the war-torn ground. Despite the hostilities and prejudices between their rival species, Dylan refused to let her die. He made the perilous choice to bring this enemy Andorian combatant back to their remote outpost for emergency treatment, an act of compassion alien to Lyra's brutal people. As Dylan worked frantically to heal Lyra's horrific wounds and ease her excruciating pain, he uncovered clues of an imminent Andorian invasion. This surprise attack could annihilate humanity's vulnerable colonies in the sector, wiping out their fragile foothold among the stars. Dylan realized Lyra's knowledge could be the key to thwarting the catastrophic assault, but she still pledged staunch loyalty to her kind and harbored a deep distrust of humans, even as her own people had sentenced her to agonizing death for her perceived failure and weakness. Emotions ran high at the base, with soldiers protesting the presence of an Andorian they considered a mortal enemy. Many of them bore deep scars from devastating losses inflicted by Lyra's merciless brethren. A simmering tension and culture clash threatened to explode as the outpost struggled to handle this unprecedented situation. As his commanding officers debated the next steps, Dylan knew the stakes couldn't be higher. If he couldn't find a way to build trust with Lyra, to break through the impenetrable barriers between their clashing cultures and ideologies, then the Andorian attack would commence unimpeded. Millions of human lives would be lost in a heartbeat. Dylan needed to transform this tenuous ceasefire with a bitter rival into an unlikely alliance. Lyra held critical intel on Andorian military strategy that could turn the tide. But in her heart still burned a seething resentment, a disgust at her own helplessness under the care of a human enemy, even as she reluctantly admired their advanced medicine and Dylan's foreign concepts of empathy and compassion. With the clock counting down to a potentially unstoppable Andorian onslaught, the fate of the human colonies and the precarious intergalactic balance of power hung on the question of whether a human soldier's mercy could spark an unexpected bond, heal insurmountable rifts, and shift the course of the war before it was too late. As the days turned into weeks, Lyra slowly regained her strength under Dylan's watchful care. The advanced human medical technology worked wonders on her battered body, knitting together torn flesh and mending shattered bones. But even as her physical wounds healed, the scars on her mind and soul remained raw and painful. In the quiet moments between treatments, Lyra found herself opening up to Dylan, sharing snippets of information about Andorian military tactics and troop movements. At first, the words came haltingly, tinged with guilt and uncertainty. But as Dylan listened with rapt attention, carefully recording every detail, Lyra began to feel a sense of purpose, a glimmer of hope that her knowledge could make a difference. Dylan relayed the intelligence to his superiors, who quickly realized the gravity of the situation. The threat of an Andorian invasion was no longer a distant possibility, but a looming reality. The outpost buzzed with activity as the human forces mobilized, preparing for the coming storm. But not everyone viewed Lyra's presence as a blessing. Many of Dylan's fellow soldiers, hardened by years of brutal conflict with the Andorians, saw her as a potential threat, a spy or saboteur sent to undermine their defenses from within. Whispers of dissent and suspicion echoed through the corridors of the outpost, growing louder with each passing day. Leading the charge against Lyra was Sergeant Hawkins, a grizzled veteran with a deep-seated hatred for all things Andorian. He cornered Dylan in the medical bay, his eyes flashing with barely contained rage. "You're making a mistake, Ward," Hawkins growled, jabbing a finger at Dylan's chest. "That Andorian bitch is playing you like a fiddle. She's gonna slit your throat the moment you let your guard down." Dylan stood his ground, meeting Hawkins' glare with a steady gaze of his own. "She's not a threat, Sergeant. She's a valuable asset. Her knowledge could save countless human lives." Hawkins scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're a fool, Ward. A bleeding heart. That creature doesn't deserve your mercy. She deserves a bullet between the eyes." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Dylan knew that Hawkins and his followers were a powder keg waiting to explode. If he didn't find a way to defuse the situation soon, Lyra's life would be in grave danger. As Lyra's strength returned, she began to assist Dylan in his medical duties, much to the surprise and consternation of the other soldiers. Her knowledge of Andorian physiology and combat injuries proved invaluable, allowing Dylan to treat his patients with a level of skill and precision that had been previously unthinkable. But even as Lyra worked alongside the humans, her loyalties remained torn. She had spent her entire life in service to the Andorian Empire, dedicated to the belief that her people were superior in every way. To find herself now dependent on the mercy of a human, to see firsthand the compassion and ingenuity of a species she had been taught to despise, was a bitter pill to swallow. Dylan sensed Lyra's inner turmoil, the way she struggled to reconcile her past with her present. He knew that building trust between them would be a slow and delicate process, one that could easily be shattered by a single misstep. But he also knew that Lyra held the key to preventing a catastrophic war, one that could claim millions of lives on both sides. Her insider knowledge of Andorian tactics and weak points could give the humans a fighting chance, a way to strike at the heart of the enemy's war machine. As the days ticked by and the threat of invasion loomed ever closer, Dylan found himself walking a tightrope between his duty to his own people and his growing respect for Lyra. He knew that convincing his superiors to trust an Andorian defector would be a monumental task, one that could easily backfire and cost him everything. But he also knew that the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. If the Andorians launched their attack unopposed, the human colonies would be wiped out in a matter of days, their fragile foothold among the stars reduced to ashes and dust. And so, with time running out and the stakes higher than ever, Dylan began to formulate a daring plan, one that would require all of his skill, courage, and cunning to pull off. He would need to find a way to convince Lyra to fully betray her own people, to share every scrap of knowledge she possessed about the Andorian war effort. It was a gamble, one that could easily backfire and cost them both their lives. But as Dylan looked into Lyra's eyes, he saw a glimmer of something that gave him hope, a spark of understanding, a recognition that they were both fighting for something greater than themselves. Together, they would forge an unlikely alliance, one born of desperation and necessity. And as the clock ticked down to the inevitable confrontation, they would discover that the line between enemy and friend was not as clear-cut as they had once believed. The tension in the outpost reached a boiling point. Sergeant Hawkins burst into the medical bay, flanked by a group of armed soldiers, their faces contorted with anger and disgust as they laid eyes on Lyra. "Step aside, Ward," Hawkins barked. "We're taking the Andorian for interrogation." Dylan planted himself firmly between Hawkins and Lyra's bed. "This is a medical facility. You have no authority here." Hawkins sneered. "Authority? I'm protecting this base from alien scum." The room erupted into chaos. Soldiers loyal to Dylan rushed to defend him, while Hawkins' men tried to force their way through. Fists flew and bodies slammed against walls and equipment. In the confusion, Lyra slipped from her bed and crawled towards the exit. Dylan caught sight of her escaping and fought harder to keep Hawkins distracted. Lyra stumbled out into the corridor, her legs weak from days of bed rest. Alarms blared as she made her way to an airlock, desperation driving her forward. With trembling hands, she activated the outer door and stepped out onto the planet's surface. The alien world assaulted her senses. Harsh winds whipped across a barren landscape dotted with twisted alien vegetation. Lyra pushed on, each step sending waves of pain through her healing body. Back in the medical bay, Dylan finally broke free from the melee. He ran to Lyra's empty bed, his heart racing. A quick check of the security feeds showed her fleeing into the wilderness. Damn it," he muttered, grabbing a med kit and heading for the exit. He knew he had to find her before she succumbed to the planet's dangers, or worse, fell into Andorian hands. Dylan tracked Lyra's trail across the rocky terrain, his military training kicking in. He moved swiftly but cautiously, eyes scanning for threats. In the distance, a piercing shriek echoed across the landscape. Some kind of predator, no doubt drawn by the scent of easy prey. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Dylan huddled in the lee of a rock formation, shivering despite his thermal gear. He thought of Lyra, injured and alone in this hostile environment. He had to find her, had to make her understand that not all humans were like Hawkins. Miles away, Lyra collapsed in exhaustion, her wounds reopening. As she lay there, staring up at unfamiliar stars, doubt gnawed at her. Had she made a terrible mistake in trusting Dylan, in betraying her own people? The sound of something large moving nearby jolted her from her thoughts. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding. At the outpost, Sergeant Hawkins stood before a crowd of angry soldiers. "Ward has betrayed us all," he shouted. "He's compromised our security for the sake of an Andorian spy." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Hawkins smiled grimly. "I'm taking command. We'll deal with the Andorian threat once and for all." As Hawkins began mobilizing for an attack, Dylan and Lyra found themselves trapped between two forces bent on mutual destruction. Their only hope lay in somehow bridging the gulf between their species, a task that seemed more impossible with each passing moment. Dylan and Lyra stumbled through the alien wilderness, exhaustion etched on their faces. The harsh wind whipped at their tattered clothes as they pushed forward, each step a struggle against the unforgiving terrain. "We need to find shelter," Dylan panted, scanning the horizon. His military training kicked in as he assessed their surroundings, looking for any natural formations that could provide cover. Lyra nodded, her Andorian senses on high alert. "There," she said, pointing to an outcropping of rocks in the distance. "I detect a cave system." They made their way to the cave, collapsing inside as night fell. Dylan rummaged through his pack, taking stock of their meager supplies. "We're low on rations," he muttered. "We'll need to forage soon." As dawn broke, they ventured out. Dylan's knowledge of the planet's ecosystem proved invaluable, as he identified edible plants and small creatures they could hunt. Lyra's sharp eyesight and heightened hearing allowed them to avoid dangerous predators lurking in the underbrush. Days turned to weeks as they trekked deeper into the wilderness. Lyra's wounds slowly healed, but the constant travel took its toll. One evening, as they huddled around a small fire, Lyra spoke softly. "Why did you save me, Dylan? I'm your enemy." Dylan stared into the flames. "Because it was the right thing to do, and maybe there's a chance for peace." Their conversation was cut short by rustling in the nearby foliage. Dylan reached for his weapon, but before he could react, they found themselves surrounded by a group of humans wielding primitive spears and bows. "Who are you?" demanded a grizzled man with intricate facial tattoos. "And what are you doing with an Andorian?" Dylan raised his hand slowly. "I'm Dylan Ward, from the human outpost. This is Lyra. We're friends." The tribesman's eyes narrowed. "Friends? With an Andorian? Impossible." Over the next few days, Dylan and Lyra worked to gain the trust of the nomadic tribe. Lyra's strength and resilience in the face of adversity impressed the tribe's people, while Dylan's combat skills and knowledge of advanced technology fascinated them. As they sat around a communal fire one night, the tribe's leader, Coda, leaned in close. "You speak of retaking your outpost. We know this land better than anyone. We can help you." Dylan and Lyra exchanged glances. This could be the opportunity they needed. Together with the tribespeople, they formulated a plan to infiltrate the outpost. Lyra's knowledge of Andorian tactics proved crucial as they devised strategies to bypass the defenses. "The communications array is key," Lyra explained, sketching a rough diagram in the dirt. "If we can access it, we can potentially prevent full-scale war." As they made final preparations, a distant rumble shook the ground. Dylan's face paled as he recognized the sound of orbital bombardment. "Hawkins," he growled. "He's attacking the Andorian fleet." They knew time was running out. With the tribespeople's help, they made their way back to the outpost under cover of darkness. The facility was in chaos, alarms blaring as Hawkins's forces scrambled to defend against both the Andorians and an unexpected third party that had entered the fray. Dylan, Lyra, and a small group of tribesmen slipped through a maintenance tunnel, bypassing the main defenses. They fought their way through the corridors, Lyra's combat skills matching Dylan's as they incapacitated Hawkins' loyalists. Finally, they reached the control room. Hawkins stood at the main console, his face contorted with rage as he barked orders. "It's over, Sergeant," Dylan called out, leveling his weapon. Hawkins spun around, eyes widening at the sight of Dylan and Lyra standing side by side. "You traitor!" he spat. "You doom humanity for the sake of this alien bitch?" "No," Dylan replied firmly. "I'm trying to save us all." A furious battle ensued, with Dylan and Hawkins trading blows as Lyra and the tribesmen fought off reinforcements. In the end, it was Lyra who managed to subdue Hawkins, her Andorian strength overpowering him. With trembling hands, Dylan and Lyra accessed the communications array. They broadcast a message to all sides, pleading for an immediate ceasefire. As the sounds of battle faded, they held their breath, waiting for a response. Slowly, achingly, replies began to trickle in. The human fleet, the Andorians, and even the mysterious third race agreed to stand down and open diplomatic channels. As the dust settled, Dylan and Lyra found themselves at the center of a fragile alliance. Their partnership, forged through hardship and mutual understanding, offered a glimmer of hope for a future where cooperation could triumph over conflict. But they knew the real work was just beginning. With representatives from all sides gathering at the outpost, Dylan and Lyra prepared to face their greatest challenge yet, brokering lasting peace between. The outpost's command center buzzed with activity as Dylan and Lyra pored over holographic displays, tracking the movements of Krell's forces. Sweat beaded on Dylan's forehead as he studied the latest intelligence reports. "Another supply convoy hit," he growled, banging his hand on the console. "That's the third this week." Lyra's antennae twitched with concern. "Krell's getting bolder. We need to act fast." A thunderous explosion rocked the outpost, sending tremors through the floor. Alarms blared as smoke billowed from a nearby corridor. Dylan sprinted towards the chaos, Lyra close on his heels. They arrived to find a gaping hole in the wall, bodies strewn across the floor. A team of Andorian commandos in stealth suits materialized, weapons raised. Dylan dove behind a fallen support beam, pulse rifle blazing. Lyra rolled to cover behind an overturned table, returning fire with deadly precision. The air crackled with energy blasts as both sides exchanged a furious barrage. "We can't keep this up," Dylan shouted over the din. "We need a new strategy." As the smoke cleared, Dylan's mind raced. He knew they couldn't win through force alone. With a deep breath, he made a bold decision. "Assemble a strike team," he ordered, turning to Lyra. "We're taking the fight to Krell." Hours later, Dylan stood before a diverse group of warriors. Humans with grim expressions clutched advanced weaponry, while the enigmatic third race, towering figures with iridescent skin, stood silently, their alien features unreadable. "This mission is high risk," Dylan stated, his voice steady, "but it's our best shot at ending this conflict. Lyra will guide us through Andorian defenses. Our objective, capture Krell and bring him to justice." The team boarded a stealth shuttle, tension thick in the air as they slipped past Andorian patrols. Lyra's fingers danced across the controls, expertly navigating through sensor nets and minefields. As they approached Krell's flagship, Dylan's heart pounded. This was it, their one chance to turn the tide. The boarding was a blur of action. Plasma cutters sliced through the hull, and the strike team poured in. They moved swiftly through the ship's corridors, Lyra's knowledge proving invaluable as she guided them past security checkpoints and patrol routes. Suddenly they were ambushed. Krell's loyalists swarmed from hidden compartments, filling the air with deadly energy bolts. Dylan ducked and weaved, his rifle spitting fire as he fought to keep his team alive. A massive explosion rocked the ship. Klaxons wailed as emergency force fields snapped into place, cutting off their escape route. "This way!" Lyra shouted, gesturing towards a maintenance shaft. They crawled through narrow tunnels, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. Emerging onto the bridge, they found themselves face to face with Krell himself. The Andorian commander's eyes blazed with hatred as he regarded Dylan and Lyra. "Traitors," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You would destroy everything we've built, everything we fought for." "You're wrong, Krell," Lyra countered, her voice steady. "This war will destroy us all if we don't stop it now." Krell's laugh was cold and bitter. "You know nothing of destruction. Did your human friends tell you the truth about how they started this war?" Dylan's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Krell's eyes narrowed. "The humans struck first, annihilating an Andorian colony world. They claimed it was an accident, a weapons test gone wrong. But we knew the truth." Dylan's mind reeled. Could it be true? Had his own people been responsible for igniting this conflict? Lyra's voice cut through his thoughts. "Even if that's true, it doesn't justify more bloodshed. We have a chance to end this, here and now." As Krell's loyalists burst onto the bridge, weapons raised, Dylan found himself at a crossroads. The path of vengeance lay before him, promising swift justice but perpetuating the cycle of violence. The other path, fraught with uncertainty, offered a chance at lasting peace. With a deep breath, Dylan lowered his weapon. "You're right, Lyra. We can't let the past dictate our future." Krell's eyes widened in surprise, his finger tensing on the trigger of his sidearm. The fate of 3 species hung in the balance, waiting to see which path would be chosen. The revelation of Krell's words hung in the air, a poisonous cloud that threatened to choke the fragile alliance Dylan and Lyra had fought so hard to create. Dylan's mind reeled as he processed the implications. "Is it true?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did the humans really strike first?" Before Dylan could respond, alarms blared throughout the ship. The deck shuddered beneath their feet as explosions rocked the vessel. "We're under attack!" Dylan shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her towards the nearest weapons locker. They burst onto the bridge to find chaos. View screens flickered with images of sleek black ships appearing out of nowhere, their weapons tearing through the defenses of human, Andorian, and third-race vessels alike. "Who are they?" Dylan demanded, scanning the tactical readouts. A grizzled human officer looked up from his console, his face ashen. "They're calling themselves the Abyss Clan. They've hit multiple targets simultaneously, outposts, shipyards, even civilian colonies." Lyra's antennae twitched as she studied the attack patterns. "This level of coordination, they must have inside knowledge of our defenses." As the hours wore on, reports flooded in from across the sector. The Abyss Clan struck with surgical precision, crippling key installations and sowing discord among the Alliance members. Dylan smacked his palm on the command console. "We need to find out who's behind this. If we don't stop them soon, everything we've built will crumble." Lyra nodded, her eyes blazing with tenacity. "I have contacts in the Andorian intelligence network. We should start there." Over the next weeks, Dylan and Lyra delved into the seedy underbelly of galactic society. They found themselves in smoke-filled bars on backwater moons, negotiating with information brokers whose loyalties shifted with the solar winds. In a dimly lit cantina on the edge of known space, they met with a Tellarite smuggler who claimed to have information on the Abyss Clan's leadership. "The one you want goes by the name Void Walker," the Tellarite grunted, his tusks glinting in the low light. "No one's ever seen him, but word is they've got a base on some uncharted rock in the Zenda Nebula." Armed with this lead, Dylan and Lyra assembled a strike team. Human Special Forces operatives stood shoulder to shoulder with Andorian commandos and the enigmatic warriors of the Third Race. Their ship dropped out of warp on the edge of the Zenda Nebula. Through the swirling gases, they caught glimpses of a massive structure, the Void Walker's stronghold. "This is it," Dylan said, checking his weapon. "Whatever happens in there, we stick together." Lyra nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Always." They breached the outer defenses in a hail of weapons fire. Dylan ducked as an energy blast scorched the air above his head. He returned fire, his shots finding their mark in an Abyss Clan trooper's chest. Lyra moved with fluid grace, her Andorian combat training evident as she disabled 2 more enemies with swift, precise strikes. They fought their way deeper into the complex, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of ozone. As they neared the central chamber, the resistance grew fiercer. "Push forward!" Dylan shouted, rallying the strike team for one final assault. They burst into a vast circular room filled with holographic displays and pulsing energy conduits. In the center stood a group of hooded figures, their faces hidden in shadow. "Welcome," a chorus of voices spoke as one. "We are the Void Walker." Dylan's eyes widened as he realized the truth. The Void Walker wasn't a single entity, but a collective, a hive mind of brilliant, twisted individuals from across the galaxy. "Why?" Lyra demanded, her weapon trained on the group. "Why so chaos and destruction?" The Void Walker's many voices answered, "Only through conflict can true unity be achieved. We will forge a new order from the ashes of your failed alliances." Dylan's grip tightened on his weapon as he faced the architects of galactic chaos. The fate of countless worlds hung in the balance as they prepared for the final confrontation. The acrid stench of burnt circuitry filled the air as Dylan and Lyra stumbled through the wreckage of the Void Walker's stronghold. Bodies of fallen comrades and enemies alike littered the ground, a grim testament to the cost of their victory. Dylan wiped sweat and grime from his face, his eyes scanning the destruction around them. "We won, but at what price?" he muttered, his voice hoarse from shouting orders during the battle. Lyra's antennae drooped with exhaustion and sorrow. "Every life lost here was one too many," she said softly, kneeling to close the eyes of a fallen Andorian warrior. As they tended to the wounded, an urgent beep from Lyra's communicator cut through the somber atmosphere. Her eyes widened as she read the message, her blue skin paling. "Dylan, we have a problem," she said, her voice tight with concern. "It's Andoria. Commander Thrak has seized control. He's declaring war on the Alliance." Dylan's blood ran cold. "Show me." The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the stern visage of Commander Thrak. His eyes blazed with fanatical zeal as he spoke. "The time has come for Andoria to claim its rightful place as rulers of the galaxy," Thrak's voice boomed. "We will crush this pathetic alliance and bring all species under our dominion. Resistance is futile." The message cut off abruptly, leaving Dylan and Lyra in stunned silence. The gravity of the situation settled over them like a suffocating blanket. "We need to act fast," Dylan said, his mind racing. "If Thrak's forces gain a foothold, everything we've fought for will be lost." Lyra nodded grimly. "I have contacts throughout the sector. We can rally what's left of the Alliance fleet." Over the next several days, Dylan and Lyra worked tirelessly, sending encrypted messages to allies across the galaxy. They coordinated from the bridge of their battered flagship, holographic star charts flickering around them as they plotted strategy. "The Rigelians have pledged their support," Lyra reported, her fingers dancing across the control panel. "That gives us a fighting chance against Thrak's fleet." Dylan studied the tactical display, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's not enough," he said finally. "A direct confrontation would cost millions of lives on both sides. We need another way." Lyra's antennae twitched thoughtfully. What if we could get to Thrak directly, cut off the head of the snake?" Dylan's eyes lit up. "A covert operation. If we can neutralize Thrak, we might be able to end this before it spirals into full-scale war." They assembled their strike team with care, selecting operatives from each allied species. A towering Rigelian warrior stood next to a lithe Vulcan infiltrator, while a Tellarite engineer checked his equipment with meticulous care. As they prepared to embark on their mission, Dylan pulled Lyra aside. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "We'll be going up against your own people." Lyra's gaze was steady, her voice firm. "Thrak doesn't represent the Andoria I know and love. We have to stop him, for the sake of all our peoples." Their stealth shuttle slipped through Andoria's defensive grid, cloaking technology rendering them invisible to sensors. As they touched down on the icy surface of Lyra's homeworld, the team moved swiftly and silently through winding ice caverns and bustling underground cities. Lyra led the way, her intimate knowledge of Andorian security protocols proving invaluable as they bypassed checkpoints and avoided patrols. Dylan marveled at her grace and skill, a newfound respect growing within him. As they neared the Imperial Palace, tension mounted. The sprawling structure loomed before them, its crystalline spires gleaming in the pale light of Andoria's moons. "This is it," Dylan whispered, his hand resting on his weapon. "Whatever happens in there, we stick together." Lyra nodded, her eyes meeting his. A silent understanding passed between them, born of shared trials and unwavering trust. They breached the palace defenses, moving swiftly through ornate corridors. The sounds of battle erupted around them as loyalist forces clashed with Thrak's guards. Dylan and Lyra fought side by side, their movements perfectly synchronized as they pushed deeper into the heart of the complex. Finally, they burst into the throne room. Commander Thrak stood at the center, his imposing figure radiating malevolence. His cold eyes narrowed as he beheld Dylan and Lyra. "So," Thrak sneered, "the traitor returns with her human pet in tow." Lyra's voice rang out clear and defiant. "It's over, Thrak. Your vision of Andorian supremacy ends here." Thrak's laughter was harsh and mocking. "You fool. I am Andoria's destiny, and I will crush anyone who stands in my way." With a roar of rage, Thrak charged forward, his ceremonial blade glinting in the harsh light. Dylan and Lyra braced themselves, ready to face the greatest challenge of their lives. The clash of blades echoed through the throne room as Thrak's ceremonial weapon met Dylan's energy blade. Sparks flew as the two men locked in combat, their faces inches apart. "You cannot stop the inevitable," Thrak snarled, his breath hot on Dylan's face. Dylan gritted his teeth, muscles straining as he pushed back against Thrak's superior strength. "Nothing's inevitable except your downfall." Lyra somersaulted over Thrak's head, her boot connecting with his spine. The Andorian commander stumbled forward, giving Dylan the opening he needed to land a solid punch to Thrak's jaw. Alarms blared throughout the palace. Thrak wiped blood from his lip, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You're too late. My forces are already mobilizing." As if on cue, the ground shook with the thunderous footsteps of approaching troops. Dylan and Lyra exchanged a quick glance, both realizing their dire situation. "We need to move," Lyra urged, grabbing Dylan's arm. "Now!" They sprinted from the throne room, ducking energy blasts that scorched the ornate walls. The palace corridors became a maze of chaos as loyal guards clashed with Thrak's supporters. Dylan and Lyra weaved through the melee, using the confusion to their advantage. They reached a service entrance, bursting out into the frigid Andorian night. "This way!" Lyra hissed, leading Dylan down a narrow alley between towering ice spires. They ran until their lungs burned, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter. Finally, they ducked into a dimly lit tavern, its patrons a motley assortment of Andorian lowlifes. "We can't stay here long," Dylan panted, scanning the room for potential threats. Lyra nodded, her antennae twitching nervously. "I know someone who might help. An old friend from my academy days. He runs a network of safe houses for political dissidents." As they made their way through Andoria's winding streets, evidence of Thrak's iron grip was everywhere. Propaganda holovids flickered on every corner, extolling the virtues of Andorian supremacy. Armed patrols marched in formation, their expressions hard and unforgiving. Lyra led Dylan to a nondescript building wedged between two larger structures. She rapped on the door in a specific pattern. After a tense moment, it slid open, revealing a grizzled Andorian with a cybernetic eye. "Lyra," he whispered, disbelief evident in his voice. "By the ice moons, I thought you were dead." "Not yet, Jar," Lyra replied with a grim smile. "We need your help." Inside, Jar's safe house was a hive of activity. Andorians from all walks of life huddled around communication terminals, monitoring Thrax movements and coordinating resistance efforts. As the days passed, Dylan and Lyra moved from one hiding spot to another, always one step ahead of Thrax forces. They gathered intel, piecing together the full scope of the commander's plans. In an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the capital, they pored over stolen data files. Dylan's eyes widened as he scrolled through the information. "This can't be right," he muttered. "Bioweapons, planet-killing technology, Thrax preparing for full-scale galactic domination." Lyra's face paled. "We have to stop him, but how? We're outnumbered, outgunned." Dylan's fists tight as he formulated a plan. "We hit him where it hurts, his weapons research facility. If we can sabotage his efforts, we might buy enough time for the Alliance to mount a proper defense." They spent the next several days recruiting a team. An ex-Andorian commando with a score to settle. A brilliant scientist who'd refused to work on Thrax projects. A master hacker with a penchant for causing chaos in Andorian systems. Under cover of darkness, they approached Thrax's heavily fortified research complex. Towering energy barriers crackled around the perimeter, while heavily armed guards patrolled in tight formation. "This is it," Dylan whispered to the assembled team. "No matter what happens in there, remember what we're fighting for. The fate of the entire galaxy rests on this mission." Lyra squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, volumes passed between them without a word spoken. The team moved with practiced precision. The hacker worked her magic, creating a brief window in the facility's defenses. They slipped inside, immediately engaging Thrax elite guards in a firefight. Energy bolts sizzled through the air as Dylan and Lyra fought side by side, covering each other's blind spots with fluid teamwork. They pushed deeper into the complex, facing increasingly desperate resistance. Finally, they reached the central laboratory. What they found inside chilled them to the core. A massive device dominated the room, pulsing with sickly green energy. Holographic readouts displayed its horrifying potential, a plague that could wipe out entire species in a matter of days. "We have to destroy it," Lyra said, her voice filled with quiet willpower. As they approached the doomsday weapon, klaxons blared. A computerized voice filled the air. "Warning, core destabilization imminent. Catastrophic overload in 60 seconds. Dylan's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. They could destroy the weapon, but at the cost of their own lives. Or they could flee, potentially allowing Thrax to perfect his terrible creation. Time seemed to slow as Dylan and Lyra locked eyes, the weight of their decision pressing down upon them. The icy winds howled as Dylan and Lyra stumbled through the blinding snow. Their breaths came in ragged gasps visible in the frigid air. Behind them, the distant whine of Thrax pursuit vehicles grew louder. "We can't keep this pace," Dylan panted, his legs burning with exhaustion. Lyra's antennae twitched, sensing vibrations in the ice. "There's a crevasse ahead. We can lose them there." They half ran, half slid down a treacherous slope, jagged ice formations looming on either side. As they reached the bottom, a massive ice shelf cracked and fell, sealing the entrance behind them. For a moment, they stood in darkness, hearts pounding. Then Lyra activated a small light, illuminating a vast network of ice caves stretching into the distance. "We should be safe here for now," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. As they caught their breath, the gravity of their situation sank in. They were alone, cut off from their allies, with the destiny of the universe resting on their shoulders. Days blurred together as they navigated the treacherous Andorian wilderness. They crossed razor-sharp ice fields, narrowly avoided plunging into hidden crevasses, and huddled together for warmth during the brutal nights. On the fifth day, as they crested a ridge, they spotted a small encampment nestled in a sheltered valley below. Thin trails of smoke rose from hide-covered dwellings. "The nomads," Lyra whispered, a spark of hope in her eyes. As they approached, figures emerged from the tents, brandishing primitive but deadly-looking weapons. An elder stepped forward, his weathered face creased with suspicion. "Who are you, outsiders?" he demanded in the Andorian tongue. "What business do you have in our lands?" Lyra spoke, her voice steady despite their exhaustion. "We seek your help. Commander Thrak threatens not just Andoria, but the entire galaxy." The elder's eyes narrowed. "Thrak's warmongering does not concern us. We left that world behind long ago." Dylan stepped forward, his voice hoarse but passionate. "With respect, you can't escape this. If Thrak succeeds, there won't be anywhere left to hide." For long moments, the elder regarded them silently. Finally, he nodded. "Come, you will tell us your story." Inside the largest tent, they recounted their harrowing journey. As they finished, murmurs rippled through the gathered nomads. The elder spoke again, his voice grave. "Your courage is admirable, but what you ask is impossible. The temple you seek lies in the heart of winter, a place no one has returned from in living memory." Lyra leaned forward, her eyes intense. "We have no choice. The artifact in that temple may be our only hope of stopping Thrak." After heated debate among the tribe, a young warrior named Jean stepped forward. "I will guide them," he declared. "The old ways must sometimes yield to necessity." As they prepared for the next leg of their journey, Dylan noticed Lyra standing apart, her gaze distant. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. She turned to him, conflict evident in her eyes. "I've spent my life fighting for unity between our peoples. Now I find myself relying on those who rejected that very idea." Dylan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe this is the first step towards bridging that divide." Lyra nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Perhaps you're right." As dawn broke, they set out with Jean and two other nomad warriors. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, with howling winds that threatened to sweep them off narrow ice bridges. On the third day of their trek, as they navigated a field of ice spires, a bone-chilling roar echoed through the valley. John's eyes widened in fear. "Ice Stalker!" he hissed. "We must move now!" They scrambled for cover as a massive, white-furred creature bounded into view, its gleaming fangs as long as Dylan's forearm. The beast's nostrils flared, catching their scent. With nowhere left to run, Dylan and Lyra exchanged a determined glance. They had come too far to falter now. Side by side, they readied themselves to face this new threat, acutely aware that their quest and the fate of the galactic realm hung in the balance. Balance. The Ice Stalker's roar shook the very ground beneath their feet as it bounded towards them, its massive form a blur of white fur and razor-sharp claws. Dylan rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's initial lunge. Lyra's energy blade hummed to life as she slashed at the beast's flank, leaving a scorched gash in its thick hide. The Ice Stalker howled in pain and fury, its tail whipping around and catching Jean in the chest, sending him flying into a nearby ice formation. "We need to work together," Dylan shouted, his voice barely audible over the howling wind and the creature's snarls. Lyra nodded, her antennae twitching as she assessed their surroundings. "The ice spires! If we can bring them down." Understanding flashed in Dylan's eyes. He fired his blaster at the base of the nearest spire, the energy bolt melting through the ice. Lyra followed suit, targeting another spire on the opposite side of the beast. The Ice Stalker, sensing the danger, lunged at Dylan. He dove forward, sliding beneath the creature's massive body and firing upward, singeing its underbelly. The beast's agonized roar was cut short as the weakened ice spires groaned and toppled, burying the stalker beneath tons of crystalline debris. Panting heavily, Dylan and Lyra helped John to his feet. The nomad warrior's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and respect. "You fight well," John said, wincing as he massaged his bruised ribs. "Perhaps there is hope for our mission after all." They pressed onward, the unforgiving landscape gradually giving way to sheer cliffs of blue-white ice. After hours of treacherous climbing, They crested a final ridge and beheld their destination. The temple was a marvel of ancient Andorian engineering, its spires and arches seeming to grow organically from the mountain itself. Intricate patterns were carved into every surface, telling the story of a civilization long past. "By the frozen moons," Lyra breathed, her voice filled with awe. "I never thought I'd see it with my own eyes." As they approached the temple's massive entrance, Dylan felt a sense of foreboding. "Stay alert," he warned. "If the stories are true, this place is filled with traps." No sooner had the words left his mouth than the ground beneath their feet began to shift. Panels of ice slid away, revealing a yawning chasm below. Dylan leapt forward, his fingers scrabbling for purchase on the icy floor. Lyra's hand shot out, grasping his wrist and pulling him to safety. "Thanks," Dylan gasped, his heart pounding. That was too close. They advanced cautiously, each step fraught with danger. Razor-sharp icicles plummeted from the ceiling, forcing them to dodge and weave. Hidden pressure plates triggered bursts of frigid air that threatened to freeze them solid. In one chamber, they faced a dizzying array of mirrors, each reflection hiding a deadly energy beam. Lyra's keen senses proved invaluable as she guided them through the maze, her antennae detecting subtle variations in the air currents. Hours passed as they delved deeper into the temple's depths. Dylan and Lyra moved in perfect sync, their bond strengthened by each obstacle overcome. Jean and the other nomads watched in amazement as the outsiders navigated challenges that had stymied their people for generations. Finally, they reached the inner sanctum. The circular chamber pulsed with an otherworldly energy, its walls adorned with ancient Andorian script. At its center, floating in a column of shimmering light, was the artifact they sought, a crystal that seemed to contain the very essence of Andoria itself. Dylan stepped forward, his hand outstretched towards their prize. Suddenly, a familiar voice cut through the air. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." They spun to see one of the nomad warriors, his face twisted in a sneer, training a weapon on them. In his other hand, he clutched a communicator bearing Thrax insignia. "Vraxen!" Jean spat. "You betray your own people?" The traitor laughed coldly. "My people? The strong will rule, as it should be. Thrak will lead Andoria to its rightful place in the galaxy." Before anyone could react, Vraxen lunged for the artifact. His fingers closed around the crystal, and a blinding surge of energy erupted from its core. The temple shook violently as raw power coursed through the chamber. Vraxen screamed, his body contorting as the artifact's energy consumed him. Cracks spider-webbed across the walls and ceiling, chunks of ice raining down around them. "We have to contain it," Lyra shouted over the deafening roar of the artifact's power. Dylan met her gaze, understanding passing between them without a word. They stepped forward, hands clasped tightly together, and embraced the searing energy. Pain unlike anything they had ever experienced tore through their bodies, yet they held fast, their combined will pushing back against the tide of destructive force. "Lyra!" Dylan gasped, his vision blurring. I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Me too." As consciousness slipped away, their last thoughts were of each other, and of the hope that their sacrifice would not be in vain.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.